Thank you very much for joining us this morning, and it's sort of really come about as a result of the collaboration with the Healthy Weight, Healthy Horse campaign with vet partners. I'm Katie Williams, I'm the technical manager at Dengie, and obviously you know Andrea, I think, who has disappeared off the screen somewhere, but she's your sort of regional manager. So between us, if there's things we can collaborate on, like talks, weighbridge clinics, whatever it might be, that's very much what we're here to help with. So we kind of focus on the obesity issue, and one of the things that we see quite a lot, I have to say, on yards is the fact that if your pony isn't as fat as the very fat pony next door, it doesn't seem to register as being such a big issue. And we even find it with our own team when you go out to do a weighbridge clinic. So we take the weighbridge to get an actual weight, but we're also condition scoring these ponies as well, because arguably that's the more interesting sort of parameter to be educating horse owners about. The temptation is to slide the scale, but once they are obese, basically they're a score 5 or a 9, whatever you're going to use, even if there's a fatter one that comes out next. So it's one of the things we try to focus on with horse owners, is to resist the temptation to slide the scale. So just because Slim Jim, the grey pony there, is a 5++, shall we say, if you're the owner of the Exmoor, that doesn't mean to say he's a 4.5 just because the one next door is actually even fatter. They're still both a 5. We tend to use the 5-point scale, and then put half points in, which effectively makes it a 9-point scale anyway. Now, Tamsin Furtado and her colleagues up in Liverpool have done quite a lot of the sort of social side of the research on obesity and why it's such a big issue in our industry. And these are some quotes from the sort of interviews and the research that she did. She presented at Beaver last year, and I think the year before as well, whenever it was last held. And it's this problem, I think, that until an awakening event happens, which in this case is usually laminitis, no action is taken. So you need that sort of smack in the face where the animal is actually clinically has a clinical problem, before people address the issue of weight management or weight loss. And again, sometimes it actually takes somebody pointing out to the horse owner, and this is Tamsin's big push, and certainly what she was trying to encourage and make the point about at Beaver last year, is that particularly in our context, if a vet doesn't tell a horse owner that an animal is overweight, then the automatic assumption is that it's okay, because if a vet hasn't said anything about it, then it must be all right. Now, we'll come to some of the further research that we've been doing on that in a bit, but effectively somebody needs to turn the awakening event into I suppose an instruction to take action rather than a clinical problem occurring. I thought this quote from the farrier was really interesting, that people talk about an attack of laminitis, and like a ninja came in. It's not an attack, it is something that's built up. So it is a chronic problem, it's just the acute symptoms that you inevitably have to end up dealing with. So it really is this case of trying to get them to take action sooner before it is a problem. Now, I'm actually doing my PhD part-time at Glasgow, and one of the things that we've been looking at is the language used when professionals do consultations with owners. And Tamsin started this in her work, in the sense that people with horses that are overweight really see it as a battle of the bold. It's like it's a war. They describe EMS as sort of native pony syndrome. It's almost like it's something beyond their control that they're having to battle against all the time. And the grass is lethal at the moment was a quote from some of the research that we did last year. So they really see it as a confrontation or a challenge that they're having to deal with. And certainly in my research, the horse owner really wants the empathy directed at them rather than the horse, and our temptation is to feel sorry for this fat pony or this overweight horse that's just got laminitis, and yet the owner sees it as a real problem for the biggest problem is for them. So where we try and direct our empathy can have an impact on how effective or how efficiently the advice is then adhered to. So how do we go about tackling it? Well, context is everything. I think as a nutritionist, there is an inherent expectation that when we go to see a horse, that we're going to raise the issue of body weight and condition. It's kind of fundamentally linked to a nutritional consultation. Whereas if you're a vet and you're going out there to do something like a vaccination or a routine dental check or something, it's much harder to just drop into conversation. And I say much harder for a lot of people to drop into conversation that an animal is sort of overweight or obese and that action needs to be taken. And I've put sort of, it is harder for you because it's context is everything. And I've done a few training sessions now with both vet students as part of my studies, and obviously working with the Vet Partners campaign. And there are some vets that don't have any issue with this at all. If the animal's fat, they're going to sort of tackle it head on. But there's a lot of research to show, especially in small animals as well as equine, that it is hard to bring this subject up if the owner is particularly tricky. Possibility of them taking offence. You don't want the bad write-up on social media afterwards. And we've had that as nutritionists, and our team have had people posting on Facebook, or the Dengie rep said my horse was fat, kind of thing, and in a sort of really upset kind of a tone of voice. It's hard, isn't it, to put yourself out there and potentially invite criticism. But I think that's an area that we have to address. And going back to Furtado's work, if we don't, especially as nutritionists and vets, raise this issue, there is no hope of us tackling this chronic problem of obesity. So where do we start when it comes to the diet? And this was the training session I did as part of my studies for 3 different vet student groups over the last sort of 12, 18 months. And one of the findings from previous studies is that the hardest part is trying to give some structure to the ration and breaking it down into manageable levels of information. Now, in pet nutrition, it's relatively easy. It sort of should be 1 bag, low calorie feed or food, and no treats. And ideally some more exercise. And in the recent sort of training session I did with the vet students, this was the approach. If they weren't particularly horsey or didn't have that much experience of horse ownership themselves, this was very much the approach they took with horses. And I have to say, treats and bucket feed in most cases is not the problem for horses. So what we came up with was a mnemonic of go for broke, so grazing, forage and bucket. So trying to break the diet down into 3 parts, because unlike small animal pets, we've got those very difficult to quantify elements of the diet, which are grazing and the forage. But they're the bits that actually make up the biggest part of the ration. So if we go with the sort of minimum of 1.5% of body weight as sort of grazing and forage, that's the minimum amount the horse needs, then it's going to be around about 3/4, maybe 2/3 to 3/4 of the total diet. So that is where we have the greatest opportunity really to make the biggest impact. And yet in the training session we did with the students, before we gave them the structures and the tools to formulate a ration and do a diet plan, forage was hardly ever mentioned. I mean, they talked about low sugar, no sugar, that sort of thing, but there was no structure as to how much and how to control grass intake and all those sorts of things. It was definitely cut down the bucket feed, cut out the treats and exercise more. And obviously you can't even always exercise some of these horses and ponies more either. So that's what we were trying to sort of look at with them. And if we apply that to our advice that we're giving out, the reason that grass is a big part of the obesity problem these days, and probably has been for quite some time now, is that the energy gap is definitely getting smaller. So in other words, grass is typically growing all year round. We've put some average values across the screen here. The yellow is the sort of energy intake from grass just for a 500 kilo horse. If we assume they're out of the grass 24/7 on average grazing, that's the sort of level of energy they're going to be consuming. And the blue line at the bottom going to run across the screen is the sort of requirements that you need just for maintenance. And then if you're doing light work, it's the green line. So you can see it's really only in the depths of winter that the energy gap exists at all for maintenance now. So in other words, supplementary feed might be needed to keep weight and condition on the horse. And I could argue that, quite frankly, we haven't had any snow at all in the southeast this year. The grass has certainly been growing throughout the winter to some degree or another, and it's very likely that we're probably going to find that yellow line tipping, coming even further up. So probably at most times throughout the whole of the year, the energy from grass would be sufficient. So that tells us in a nutshell, we've got to reduce the intake in most cases for most of the time throughout the year for these good doer types. How do we do that? Well, again, how many times have we come across horse owners that say, oh, it's on a starvation paddock or a bare paddock, it lives off fresh air, but there is still grass out there, and quite frankly, it's going somewhere if it's not growing in the field. So or if it's not visible in the field, it's still growing, so the horse is eating it. And a true bare paddock, and the only way to get complete control over what's going in, is to bring them off grass and put them on something like wood chips. Wood chips is generally preferable to obviously like sand schools and things because of the risk of potentially sand colic if they're feeding forage off the floor. And there are more and more livery yards that are starting to provide this level of, I suppose, service really for these good doers, and it is just giving you complete control. And this is where it comes back to thinking about how the horse owner, it's all about them and their battle against the bulge. Well, if we can increase the amount of control they have by bringing the horse off grass, it's one of the variables we can then eliminate, and then literally we are controlling more of what's going in the horse's mouth. But there are yards where they won't provide these sorts of facilities, and then it gets tougher to control intake, and we start to rely on things like grazing muzzles. Now, one of my colleagues, Tracy, she did a sort of preliminary study on grazing muzzles for her master's degree. She found about a restriction in intake of around 75 to 86%. That was back in 2005. That was sort of followed by published work by Annette Longland and colleagues in 2011, and found a similar reduction in intake, which is nice to see that the two studies were pretty much identical. So they are effective at reducing intake if you can keep them on the horse. So some of the strategies for trying to stop the Houdinis escaping from them are putting, sort of plaiting the mane or the forelock over the top of the head collar to try and keep them on that way. And obviously the whole sort of principle of how long you put them on is an area that some people don't like leaving them on for too long, but obviously as soon as you take them off, then the horse is going to consume a lot more. Some of the studies have shown in a 3-hour period they consumed about 0.8% of their body weight in those 3 hours when they hadn't got muzzles on. So the general advice is to wear them for say 10 to 12 hours in a 24-hour period, and then bring them off of good grass or the good grazing for the rest of the time that you aren't going to put the muzzle on. You do need to encourage the horse to sort of drink with them on, and we do find examples of when horses are kept in groups that it can mean that some are bullied because they obviously can't use their teeth to sort of bite back or fight back. So there are implications for wearing them, and we have started to come across people where sort of complaining about the fact that they've eroded their horses in sizes, so where they're kind of grazing against particularly the sort of plastic bucket ones for prolonged periods of time, that it's actually eroding some of the teeth at the front. So there are some issues or challenges with using them. Also work with charities where they're open to the public, and they have to have a member of staff explaining all the time what the muzzle is, so they just don't do it anymore because the general public hate the sight of them. So there are certain scenarios where they might not be applicable or appropriate to use, but if you've got a horse on its own in a sort of sectioned off grazing area, they can actually be a really effective way of reducing grass intake. So if we're going to get control over what's going in and take the grass out, then forage becomes important as a replacer, because we have to, obviously, for general health and well-being, mental behaviour, all those sorts of issues, we want forage going in. The horse needs to be eating. One of the areas that we haven't really, I think, explored in equine nutrition fully is the issue of the sort of digestive health and this leaky gut syndrome. So we know it's a thing in other species, obviously, and in studies that have been done in mice where they put them on much lower fibre intakes, it compromises the integrity of the gut, and it makes it leakier if they haven't got so much fibre going in. Obviously, fibre is broken down and gives you things like butyrate, which is one of the volatile fatty acids. That's the energy substrate the colonocytes use themselves. And we know the link between sort of leaky gut and permeable gut and the potential for laminitis and things like that. So it makes sense if we can try to keep the forage or fibre intake up. Now, if we're trying to promote weight loss, even if I can get my teeth in, we've got to find that balance between chew time, forage, and sort of gut health. And it's one of those weird anomalies that we don't really know how much fibre a horse actually needs. We just tend to work in how much forage they need. So the current recommendations are to aim for at least 1.5% dry matter of the horse's body weight per day, even for a good doer. Now, you can see the sort of values there. It's around about 8.8 kilos as fed of a hay that's 85% dry matter. Now, if that is too much and is actually resulting in weight gain or not actually achieving weight loss, then the preference, rather than reducing the amount of forage that goes in, is to find something that's a lower energy density forage, so we get more chews for less calories. Now, we wanted to sort of really focus on this as part of the Healthy Weight, sort of Healthy Horse campaign. And it met with a bit of discussion when we did the original launch meeting to the champions from each practice, because I think in an acute scenario where you really need to achieve some significant weight loss, the veterinary perspective may well be to go below that 1.5% dry matter, which is fine. We've just got to bear in mind the repercussions of doing it and how long we're going to do it for. So of the studies that have been done, and when you dig a bit deeper into some of these in terms of what they were measuring, it is quite revealing. So Dugdale et al. Back in 2010 is regularly cited as they restricted intake to 1% of body weight in dry matter. Now that achieved a significant weight loss, as you would expect, because we're halving the ration, and they said without adverse effects on the welfare of the horse. Now that is regularly cited in subsequent work, but when you look at the criteria they used to measure welfare, it related to behaviour, the time the pony spent in 3 different categories, so eating, resting and play, but there was no reference in that study to what I would consider things like gut health, general overall gastric health, gastric ulcers, and so on and so forth. And the study lasted 12 weeks. Then more recently, Morgan et al. State they initially recommend 1.5% of body weight in fresh weight of hay, but adjusted if necessary, depending on response. Now, the issue with that, and this is where the clarity of message really needs to be refined, I think, is that when you start to then soak the hay, and if you're soaking it for prolonged periods, which is quite commonly done for managing laminitis and weight, etc., then you are losing dry matter from doing that, and you could be dropping quite a lot below that sort of 1.5% fresh weight quite quickly. So the recommendation as it stands at the moment, and Dave Rendell and colleagues cite it in their paper in 2020, 1.5% dry matter basis, and this is the level that would suggest most equine nutritionists would work to for the long-term management of good doers. Now I'm talking 6-12 months, not an acute scenario where you might want to achieve some significant weight loss for 12 weeks. So I think that's where all of these messages can become very confused. Even at Beaver last year, there were some very sort of muddy, shall we say, interpretations and discussions about this. But if you're going for the balance between health, weight loss, weight management, and trying to keep everything else healthy, so avoiding ulcers, etc., 1.5% on a dry matter basis for the long term is, I think, where the consensus would be. If you need to go lower than that, you should very much consider it for the shorter term periods, i.e. 3 months. And it's something we're really quite keen to sort of clarify. Similarly, the use of straw, and again, this created a little bit of discussion at the launch. We find that straw gets a lot of negative press. There's been a study done several years ago now, and it was based in Scandinavia, where they showed that if straw was the sole or predominant source of forage in the ration, it increased the risk of gastric ulcers. Now, we don't tend to find in the UK that people would use straw as the sole forage source. Gradually, we are finding that people are willing to sort of use it more as a tool, as part of the ration. And a subsequent paper, which was published by Janssen et al. At the end of last year, built on that study that was done historically to try and show that actually you could use 50% wheat straw to replace, in this case, haylage, with no ill effects in the context of gastric ulcers. So it didn't increase the risk of ulcers by replacing haylage with 50% wheat straw. Now, we've shown that if you replaced a third of an average hay with straw, it would actually achieve a 16% reduction in energy intake. So the better quality forage you're replacing, the more you are actually reducing the calorie intake, obviously. And then if you're going to go up to 50%, then clearly, again, it's an increase in that reduction. So you're sort of talking potentially having a 25% reduction in energy if you can replace a good quality forage with up to 50% straw. Now, we tend to use oat straw in our products, and it is the straw that would be the sort of first choice. There have been this study that have used wheat straw and others, and there's also been another study where they use barley. Now, for me, I would start with oat, then wheat would be your number 2 choice and barley your 3rd choice, but they've all been used in studies successfully without any ill effects. We would obviously caveat that with, if there's a history of dental issues or impaction colics and things, then it's not an obvious thing to do to then start putting straw in the ration, or a sensible thing to do. And we would encourage people to talk to their vet about the use of straw in those sorts of situations. But it is a great tool. Now, the very last point that on this slide that you probably can't see that well, but this paper was the first one to really show, and it's something I feel really strongly about, and it needs more research, is the importance of slowing the rate of intake of forage as well. So we talk about it in the bucket feed by putting chopped fibre in, making the sort of, if we are going to meal feed these animals, make it take as long as possible. But what's really encouraging from this study is that they slowed the rate of intake by using straw to the extent at which there was basically no insulinic response in the evening meal, shall we call it that, or the evening feed, having eaten the straw, because the straw takes them so long, it slows them down when they're eating the rest of their forage ration. There was no discernible impact on the insulinic response. So in that sense, if you've got something with ID potentially, then trying to slow the rate of intake by using these forages, and it does sound wasteful, but even if the horse kind of doesn't eat the straw, but having to pick it out and eat around it slows them down, from my point of view, that's mission accomplished. So it has its place, even if the horse isn't actually consuming it. One of the key points I just wanted to make in terms of forages and their quality is this was a great piece of work done by Cecilia Muller, because for once they actually took all the different forages from the same field at the same time. So trying to eliminate some of the variables that we typically come across, because you're trying to compare hay from Scotland with a haylage sample from Essex and so on and so forth. But because they were able to take it from the same field and conserve it in 3 different ways, it actually gave us a really good insight into what the conservation technique is, impact it's having on the forage itself. And I've dropped in there some of the data that we have from the forage analysis we do, and where we would just use this term wrapped hay to describe some of these forages that are dried to the point that they're practically hay, and then they're actually wrapped. And you can see there, in a true hay, your sugar value is around, and that's quite low for a WSC. So simple sugars would be around about 10 to 12, and that's what we're aiming for. A WSC would typically be, well, anywhere from 17 to 20%, and the highest ones, and I've got an example at the end that we've seen, are in the sort of 30, 35%. Now, because it's dry, there's obviously no fermentation, it's not wrapped, so it's air dried, and that's what's preserving or conserving that forage. If you make a proper haylage, which would have a dry matter of around, say, 50 to 60%, then you get a little bit of fermentation. So you can see the sugar level has dropped, and we've actually got some lactic acid, which is the end product of that fermentation process. And that's as you'd expect. The sugar is the energy substrate for that fermentation process. And obviously with the silage, it's much wetter, so there's more fermentation potential that can occur, and the lactic acid level, the acidity level has risen considerably. So what we find with these wrapped hays is that they are too dry, so the sugar levels are typically basically that of a hay, and you don't get very much fermentation at all. Now, this has implications particularly for a horse that might have ulcers, because we're obviously trying to avoid things like more acidic forages, but with a wrapped hay, there isn't that much acidity there. So if they're softer and more digestible, they can actually be appropriate things to use for animals that might be prone to ulcers or have ulcers. The reason for dropping this slide in here really is that we have a battle. There is a definite prejudice against some of these wrapped forages for any horse that might be prone to laminitis or overweight. Now, obviously, we wouldn't want to be using something that's very digestible, that's going to promote weight gain. But if it is practically, a wrapped hay, there isn't much difference between the two sort of forages, a normal traditional air dried hay or something that actually is more accurately described as a wrapped hay rather than a haylage. We can do that forage analysis for people if you want to check it, just be absolutely sure. And again, we've got a good case study at the end where if you're going to do the analysis, you might as well sort of use what it tells you, even if it's instinctively not the right thing that you would think would happen, rather than doing the analysis and then sticking with what you're going to do anyway. So I'll explain more when we get to that. And then lastly, we've got the bucket feed. So the challenge is really supplements versus balancers. They're both sort of low calorie options. The balancer usually comes in a pelleted form. It's a much lower feeding rate, so it's concentrating up all the essential nutrients, the copper, the selenium, all those trace minerals that we need for good health and well-being. They're often much more practical for people to use, and you select one on the basis of the animal's life stage or their workload. The pros to supplements, I guess, are usually value for money. So if someone is on a really tight budget, then a powder supplement is a perfectly acceptable way to supply those trace minerals and vitamins. They are helpful if someone can only visit their animal once a day, because you can put them in a very sort of small amount of chopped fibre just to mix them in, and it is job done. And it can be as simple as that. We don't need to complicate things. One of the questions we get asked a lot when it comes to the bucket feed is sort of low sugar or low calorie. If you're using a chopped fibre feed in the bucket, then they tend to have a coating on them of some description, because the inherent nature of fibre, especially if you chop it and sort of shake it around in a bag and transport, is that it will shatter and break down. So it's the sort of fibrous material that breaks up and makes it potentially look dusty. So we would typically use oils or molasses in the industry. There are a few other different coatings, but they're the two most commonly used. And the dilemma is that oils are higher in calories or energy, but molasses is higher in sugar. So if we have the overweight laminitic, which one do we choose? Now, insulin dysregulation is associated with the higher starch and sugar intakes compared to fibre and oils. So it tends to be that we would go with the oil coating at a very low level. But if you have an animal that is just overweight, I use the word just advisedly, but you are trying to promote weight loss and you want to use it as maybe a partial hay replacer, then a molasses coating is actually the lower calorie option. And usually when you're feeding bigger volumes of it, the one that is actually more appropriate in most cases. But generally the market is moving away from molasses. There is very much an anti-molasses trend. So chops with a light oil coating tend to be the most commonly recommended. It is still a bit harsh on molasses. I mean, it is obviously a source of sugar, but if it's used sensibly and if it's used to coat low sugar feed materials, the overall sugar value in the actual finished feed is often still lower than you'd find in a grass hay. I'm thinking particularly of some of these low sugar or lightly coated straw chops or a straw and alfalfa chop, because those two ingredients are very low in sugar, naturally much lower in sugar than a grass chop would be. A little bit of molasses is not creating a sugar level that would be of concern. So one of the other questions we asked a lot is, does the type of oil matter? So the calorie values are generally the same, but the essential fatty acid content is the differentiating factor. So linseed is the best source of omega-3 in sort of common use. And unfortunately, it is that sort of high omega-3 content that actually makes the oil less stable. So it's much more prone to rancidity. So if you are going to add linseed, our recommendation would be to use it as like a linseed meal or a mash or something. And the most common oils used would typically be rapeseed oil and soya oil. And they have pros and cons, but effectively you're using it as a source of energy rather than for its omega-3 content. So this is the molasses-free range from Dengie, the ones that we tend to recommend in these scenarios. So as a general principle, the hi-fi is a combination of straw and alfalfa with a rapeseed oil coating. Alpha A is a pure alfalfa in the form of chop and pellets. That is the higher calorie option. And there may be situations where you do need to use that, something that's maybe pregnant, lactating, that is prone to laminitis, and you just want that safe energy to fuel or meet the extra energy requirements. And then we have a version which has vitamins and minerals added and is therefore a balanced feed if it's fed at those recommended levels. There are some unmolassed chopped straw products, so honey chop have one called chopped oat straw. There is some debate as to how palatable it is. We buy bags, try them with the horses ourselves, and they don't particularly eat them, but they can be useful to mix in with other things to dilute other feeds. And even something like Top Shop Zero, which is again is a straw chaff, has it in feed oil, very, very low levels, but it just helps to sort of quell the dust, because inevitably in something that's sun dried, there will be a dust content. And then what can we expect to achieve? Well, we need to measure that clearly. So this is a case that we had with Jake. He was a Connemara pony, extremely overweight. We managed to get, I think, 99 kilos off of him in that sort of 11-12 month period, which is equivalent to 16 stone. And we use that stat quite a bit to say to people, if you had a pony sat in a stable and someone was sat on it 24/7, you would think that was cruel. A 16 stone man, for example, well, that's effectively the weight that that pony is lugging around every day of its life when it's over 500 kilos. We're aiming for a weight loss of between 0.5% and 1% of body weight as being realistic. So that's 2.5 to 5 kilos a week for a 500 kilo horse, or around 0.5 to 3/4 of a kilo a day. And it's estimated that to change half a condition score on a 0 to 5 scale, excuse me, requires a weight loss of 20 to 30 kilos. Just a bit of a plug for one of the things that I've been working on, which is the EquiBCS app. It's free on the Apple App Store and Google Play. It's been updated, so the graph that we showed you there for Jake, people can start to put their information in and see a graph appear. Excuse me. So currently it's actually showing as a bar chart, but it's intended to change that. They can actually share the data with you. So if they log the weights and the condition scores on there, they can then share the spreadsheet with you if you would like them to. It's a great way of getting them to take pictures. There's guides to how to condition score, and it is a great tool that's basically available for free. And this is just the last few slides, a case study that I wanted to finish on, which was a para dressage horse who was longlisted for the Olympics last year, and typically is overweight, as you can see from these photos. So January 2021, 720 kilos. By the August, we had shifted 60 kilos from Remy. But why it was interesting is the vets on the sort of BF and World Class Para program were sort of quite adamant about the forage and things he should have, i.e. not having a haylage or a wrapped hay, whatever you want to call it. He isn't allowed metformin under FEI competition rules. Whether you think it's worth trying or not is another matter, but it wasn't an option in this scenario. And we were therefore having to manage this weight loss and get him into a condition where they were less concerned about him, so that he could travel potentially to the Olympics through dietary management and weight loss strategies. But his hay, and it was his hay that came back at 36.8% WSC. We had a lower WSC option forage at 17.6%, but it was actually a wrapped hay because it was so dry, but it was the lower sugar option. And we really had to fight to get them to use the haylage or the wrapped hay. And this is what I mean, if you're going to do the analysis, then you've got to believe in the results, otherwise you might as well not bother. You're just creating yourself a conundrum. So we did sort of battle against the prejudice of wrapped forages, managed to persuade them that it was the better option. The scenario with Remy is that he is also particularly fussy, so we'll come to what we actually used in the bucket feed in a minute, but we did actually manage to get his insulin levels to drop. Now obviously he still had a long way to go, but it was a massive improvement in his insulin. Now to me this demonstrates the importance of looking at the whole diet, and that original point I made where we're thinking about treats and in his sort of bucket feed and increasing exercise, he was working at a relatively high level. He was competed by an able-bodied rider as well, so it wasn't that he wasn't being worked. It was all about the forage he was getting that was, creating this issue. Now, because he is so fussy, he won't eat anything with straw in. I think he's equivalent of a bit of a diva, quite frankly. So our challenge was to try and find something that was relatively safe to use, that he would actually eat as well. And I've just shown you all the slide of the molasses-free options, but we ended up having to go with Alpha A Original and a Performance Plus balancer, obviously given his workload, so it's appropriate for the work he's doing. But this would not be our first choice. It's just to make the point that if we get the forage under control, we can have a little bit more flexibility in the bucket feed, particularly with a horse in work. And again, you can see his weight loss journey, and you can see how he looked at the end. He's now much more forward going as well, unsurprisingly, I guess, but there's a shot of him looking a much healthier size and shape. Thank you for joining us, and sorry it's been a bit disjointed, but just to make the point, we're here to help. That's the nutrition team. You've also got Andrea in your area as well. There's lots of information, YouTube videos. You can obviously contact us via all those different methods if you want. We can do soil analysis, ration planning, product info. There's never any obligation for the horse owner, and we're always doing the best for the horse. So if it's not our product that's appropriate, we recommend others. But yeah, get in touch if you have any questions, and thank you very much for your attention.